Good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. It's fantastic to see you here this evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this Man's Up event looking at mental health. And please write in the chat if you haven't already where you're watching from. It's really nice to get an idea of how many people are watching from all over the country. I'm looking for the chat already. I'm seeing people in Bath, in Bristol, Newbury, Inverness. I wonder if you've got any snow up there still. Kent, Gosport, Ransden Heath, Hampshire, Redditch, Luton, Lincoln, South East London, Nottinghamshire, Northern Ireland, Lincoln. Fantastic. Well, you're all very, very welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Patrick Regan, and I'm a freelance writer and speaker who's also a director of the wellbeing company called Brighter Days. Brighter Days works with employers to prevent burnout in employees and has a passion to see people flourish and thrive. Well, just to let you know what's going to be happening tonight, in a minute, we're going to be meeting one of our guests, special guest, Claude Murray, who will tell us a bit about what he does. And he will be taking your questions throughout the evening. So can I really encourage you to just start writing questions in the chat? Anything that you want to ask around men's mental health particularly, please just go for it. There's nothing off limits. And then we're going to be hearing from Sean Fletcher, who you may have heard of from BBC, and he also hosted ITV's Good Morning Britain for a number of, I think it's a number of years actually. And then later on in the programme, Dan Walker, who again a lot of you would have heard of, has sent us a video especially for tonight to talk a little bit about his relationship with Welsh football manager Gary Speed. And so it's going to be a packed evening. We are going to try and finish by 8, but we're not going to get too stressed by it. So if there's questions that we haven't answered, we are happy to stay on a bit longer and just make sure that we get through the questions for you. But let me just frame a little bit of our discussion, and I'll be really fascinated to hear what you guys think about some of the challenges for guys at the moment. The reality is men are more likely to experience substance abuse and exhibit violence and more likely to die by suicide. It seems that skewed expectations about how men should display emotion can lead to a fear of being judged or for crying or for appearing weak. Men are often expected to be the breadwinners and to be strong and dominant and in control. While these aren't inherently bad things, they can make it harder for men to reach out for help and to open up. Some of the stats are quite staggering. 12.5% of men in England have a mental health disorder. 3 times more men are likely to die by suicide in England than females, and almost double the rate of men die from alcoholic specific causes than women. And the stats go on. 70% of men polled have suffered with symptoms of common mental health conditions such as anxiety, stress, or depression. 40% of men have never spoken to anyone about their mental health. And I would love you guys to write in the chat, why do you think that is? Why have 40% of men never spoken to anyone about their mental health? What are the reasons? The biggest cause of mental health issues in men's lives are 32% said work, finance 31%, and 23% said their health. 40% of men polled said it would take thoughts of suicide or self-harm to compel them to get professional help. Well, I'm really, really grateful that we've got a number of amazing speakers on tonight's program, and I want to welcome Claude Murray. Claude is a psychotherapist. I'm going to ask him what that means in a second, but if Claude can, there he is. Claude, welcome to the program. We're really, really glad that you're here. And firstly, can you tell us what a psychotherapist actually is? For those of us who would just like to have a bit more clarity on that.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. And thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure to see everybody online, but I can't see their faces. I'm not a massive fan of titles, just as a disclaimer. I do have a couple, but one of my greatest titles is being a father. So just to kind of put that out there. So I'm a psychotherapist as well as a clinical supervisor. And I think just in terms of what I do, what a psychotherapist is, I help to create spaces, one-to-one spaces, and sometimes group spaces for individuals to be able to talk about their thoughts, their feelings, and their experiences, and sometimes how their thoughts and feelings and what they've experienced has impacted them, and doing that in a way that enables them, A, to feel safe, not judged, and just being able to normalize some of the thoughts and feelings that people may have. And sometimes my work may look like exploring childhood. I believe that in every king there is a kid, so it's not uncommon for me to sit with clients. I like to use the word collaborate, whether that's male or female. And we explore childhood, how those early experiences now impact them or still impact them in the here and now. My work may look like, exploring and unpacking depression, self-esteem, divorce, grief and loss, and many of the issues that impact us as human beings. So it's really creating a space, normalizing the human experience, but giving a safe platform for people to process their thoughts and their feelings and experiences.
Yeah, I really like that, normalizing the human experience, because these are all things that happen to so many of us. And I think the thing is, it doesn't make you a bad person because you go through bad times, and so I can just see the benefit of that. I think a lot of people, and I'll speak to myself, and maybe I'll come on to this later, I'm a little bit terrified of therapy, I have to say. When I first went to therapy, I thought, oh my goodness, this sounds the most terrifying thing on the planet. But actually, as I've entered into it and committed to it, I've just seen the benefit of it myself. So people are interested in what you do, getting in touch with you at any point. How can they access what you're doing?
So I can pull it in a chat, but I guess the easiest way to get in contact with me is via my website, and it has all the information about what I do. So I run a therapeutic consultancy, I should have said, where I do one-to-one therapy, but also provide reflective spaces to organizations and to groups as well as individuals. And the aim, if I'm totally honest, is to normalize being able to talk, is to, I guess, break and dismantle the stigma that we have to have it all together, and it is all right to rock up as yourself. And both the professional and the personal can exist at the same time. So that's a bit of my agenda when it comes to working with organizations, because I feel historically we've been taught you just have to be professional. But what does that mean? I have a personal life, and sometimes our personal lives leak into our professional work. So I work with organizations providing reflective spaces for their groups and their staff. But I'll put the link to my website in the chat.
Thanks, Claude. That's fantastic. And just tell us briefly, why are you so passionate about this
Great question.
particular
So
topic?
if we were in person, you would see how tall I am. So me and Patrick standing next to each other would be like the twins or the Blues Brothers, and I'd be Danny DeVito. And I was born in the 80s, and when we used to play football, whoever kicked the ball over the fence would need a bunk up. Being fairly short, I'm 5 foot, so I never had the privilege of standing at the back when we took school photos, and even now I'm still at the front when we take the photos. But whoever kicked the ball over the fence in the 80s would climb over the fence. Being short and always being short, my friends would have to give me a bunk up to be able to climb over the fence, and then we'll get the ball and then we'll play what we know as the beautiful game, play football. So I knew what it was like as a child to need a bunk up just to play football. But in my years of living, my teens, my 20s, my 30s, and even in my 40s, at some point, I believe no matter our ethnicity, the money in our bank, the qualifications we have, the things that we acquire, at some point in our lives, we all need a bunk up. And I've been a benefit of having a bunk up to some additional support. And I believe it's a calling. I surrendered to the therapeutic calling. And the last thing I would say is that wherever I went, this statement would follow me. And the statement would be, I've never told anybody this. And this is the young Irish boy who's from a traveling community who gets into a number of fights. It's the Nigerian lady who's 50 and is in the sauna and tells me about the abortion that she had, and I'm the first person that she's ever told. It's the CEO who runs, oversees the company and breaks down, or it's the guy who's known as the gunman in the local community, breaks down in his Mercedes Benz and starts crying. And I had to ask myself, what am I putting out into the atmosphere and the ether that enables people to say that I've never shared anything? And I just believe that we all need support. I've been a beneficiary, and I believe it's a calling, and I believe I found my calling, and I'm just here to help and support, because we all need a space to be able to speak about what's going on, and we don't need to be handcuffed to our secrets. And if we reveal, then we can heal.
Wow, thanks ever so much, Claude. And Claude actually used to work for me many years ago, and so I can vouch for him through personal experience as well. And he's got an amazing story, and which hopefully we'll hear a bit about later. Do keep getting your questions coming in the chat. I can see a few of them there. Jasmine, our comms expert, is going to be collating them. So please, if you put them in the chat, they won't be missed, because Jasmine will pick up on them for us later. And so we're going to go and hear this little bit of interview. I filmed this a couple of days ago with Sean, and yeah, so interesting stuff. Check it out. Okay. Sean Fletcher will be familiar to many of you. He has hosted ITV's Good Morning Britain, Countryfile for BBC, the Sunday Morning Live show, and he's also a passionate advocate for positive mental health. Now, me and Sean share an interest. We're both Spurs fans. Now, I know what you're saying. That is probably really bad for your mental health, and you would be right. It is. And Sean is far more positive than I am. He's always telling me, in Andrew we trust. And I'm starting to worry a little bit now, but I'm hoping to hold, keep the faith. Keep the faith, Sean. That's what we need to do. Tell us, Sean, why are you so passionate about mental health? I've seen you mention it on social media, and I know from knowing you a bit, it really is very important to you.
Gosh, I mean, I'll give you the short version of a very long story, but I suppose about 10 years ago, I sort of had no understanding of mental health, mental illness, no interest in it, really. It's something that didn't really affect me. And then suddenly our son, who, when he was 13, he's 21 now, so he just started, he was at secondary school, and he was like in the second year at secondary school, what's that, year 8? So 12 to 13, he started to just spiral and wasn't able to go to school. He just really struggled to do anything. He'd just get out of bed, do really basic things. He was unable to do those things. And I mean, it was just really bizarre. It was almost like he was possessed. It was really quite alarming how quickly it happened. It was a really big spiral. He'd always been maybe at times a bit anxious. But, he'd sort of performed in choirs and been up on stage and things like that. So he's not really anxious, but just certain things had sort of triggered anxiety. And then suddenly, then we've got this spiral within the space of like, a few weeks, maybe a month. And I mean, we didn't know what to do. So as parents, and there'll be parents listening to this, who will know that feeling of, I've got to do something about it. My child is ill, but I have no idea what to do. And then you go to seek help and you're on a waiting list for months, maybe even years, and you realize quite quickly that you're on your own. And so the parents listening to this will know that feeling of, you spend weeks and your weekends just swatting up on whatever it could be. And we got a diagnosis of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and that was basically debilitating. And I, for me, who didn't really know much about OCD, didn't really know much about mental illness, it was just mind-blowing how this thing could be as debilitating as any physical disability. So our son was just unable to do anything, and we learned a lot about it because we realized we're on our own. And I suppose as we came out, we went into the tunnel, and we've come out of the tunnel. And I guess my overriding feeling as things started to get better was that how on your own you are as a parent of a child with mental health issues, but anybody struggling with mental health issues. We had to wait 9 months for the right level of care. And there are people waiting longer, adults, children, who they are at crisis point.
Yeah.
And I just had this overwhelming feeling when things started to get bad. I sort of thought, if someone is brave enough, or if the parent is brave enough to bring their child forward, if you're brave enough to come forward and say, I am struggling, we, as a wealthy nation in the world, relatively wealthy nation, we need to be helping them then, because what happens is people then become, but whether, if they're not at crisis point, they get to rock bottom. And actually financially, if you're thinking about saving money and not putting money into the mental health system,
Makes complete sense.
It doesn't make sense, because when they're at crisis point, it takes much longer, it's much more expensive to get someone better. So that was my overriding feeling. So from not really knowing much about mental illness, I became a bit of an expert in OCD with my wife, and then I started to think, this has got to change. And I had have a little bit of a platform on telly, and I thought, I've got to start doing stuff about this. So that's why I became quite passionate about mental illness, mental health, helping people. But that's children. I know you're focusing on men. Everywhere you look, if you look at any of the figures, anywhere, they're just shocking. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Whether it's waiting lists, whether it's how many people feel empowered to come forward, whatever it is. It's sort of mind-blowing. And I actually feel there's so many people who sort of were like me before, and they think, oh well, it's not really, they're wandering around in their whole world, and they think, oh, it's not for me, and then suddenly their auntie or their uncle or their mother or their child becomes ill, and they see these figures and think, oh my gosh, how is that possible? So that's my journey into mental illness. Pretty sudden. I mean, it was terrible. I won't go into, I mean, I can if you want, but I know we're focusing on men's mental health. But what my son was going through, it was heartbreaking. It was awful, and it almost broke us as a family.
Earlier in the program, I talked a little bit about some of the stats around men's mental health, which is incredibly shocking. Let me just remind ourselves of some of the things that we talked about. 77% of men have suffered with symptoms of common mental health conditions such as anxiety, stress, or depression. 40% of men have never spoken to anyone about their mental health. 29% say they're too embarrassed to speak about it, while 20% say there is a negative stigma on the issue. 40% of men polled said it would take thoughts of suicide or self-harm to compel them to get professional help. And when I sort of read those stats, I think, oh my goodness, they're quite staggering, and it's a massive question. And I'd love to know what people think in the chat. Please write in the chat what your views are on why do us blokes struggle so much with our mental health? I know there's not one reason, but Sean, when you hear those stats, what do you think about what are some of the reasons why?
Yeah, I'd say I've got the same stats here in front of me. Just to say, I'll say what I think why in just a moment. I mean, there are lots of reasons, of course, but it's just like this toxic mix, isn't it, of these stats? So 40% of men have never spoken to anyone about their mental health. That's almost half of men. Yeah. I mean, that's so sad, given that then 40% of men polled said it would take thoughts of suicide or self-harm to compel them to get professional help. And all these things mixing. So 29% of those said they were too embarrassed, and that probably is the first part of my answer to your question, that there's this feeling that as a man you can't, you shouldn't be talking about this, stiff upper lip, that sort of, you need to be strong. What I was thinking about the other day, in this long car journey, I was wandering off in my thoughts, and I thought, I don't know who my great grandfather is. As in, he was a man with a life. I mean, I've got several great grandfathers, but let's just think down one line. Like my father's father's father is my great grandfather. I don't know his name. He had a life. He lived long enough to have a child, to have my grandfather. I don't know him. I don't know his name. I don't think anybody alive today knows who he is. Can remember anything about his life. Knows anything about his character. He's forgotten. He's gone. He's buried. He's disappeared. But actually, that man who probably lived was at the end of the 1800s had so much influence on us. So he influenced my grandfather so much because he was his father, and my grandfather influenced my father so much because he was his father, and my father influenced me so much because he spent so many years in my younger years. So while my great grandfather, who I know nothing about, it diminishes as the generations go on, that man actually has quite a bit of an influence on who I am and what I am, because we've all passed it down. I think what we need to remember as men nowadays is we are a product of society, but also history and our previous generations. And life was not that only like 1 or 2 generations ago. It was completely different for men. So men would never sit down and say, I want to show a bit of vulnerability. I'm going to show that, because that would have been weak. And actually, I think society nowadays does very much of that. It projects this image that, oh, well, if you're going to talk about your feelings and say, actually, I'm really struggling here, guys, that would be a really weak thing to do. Society sort of says that now, but that's softening. But a couple of generations ago, definitely all men would have been like that. And if you weren't like that, you were a wimp, you were weak, you wouldn't get a wife, you wouldn't have a family, you wouldn't whatever. So I think there's so much in our fabric as a society and as a person that is there before we're even born, that we're having to sort of, well, I suppose our generation and the next generation are changing. But then when you read those figures that 40% of men have never spoken about their mental health, it sort of like puts that into perspective. Oh, that's because men for thousands of years haven't done that. And I guess we're trying to change that. Sorry, it's sort of this profound thought I had in the car.
It's really interesting.
This weakness,
it's really
this weakness. We're made out to be weak and underachievers in so many ways if we show vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that's changing with this generation, and I think that's really good. But it will take many generations for that to properly change.
Yeah.
But so go back to the original thing. Men don't want to talk about things because they're not meant to talk about things, because it's sort of traditionally it's a weak thing to do. And so if I was to come to you and say, look, I'm really struggling with finances, or I'm really struggling because I'm losing a job, or I'm really struggling with my marriage, or my kids are this, or like my son was ill, if I came to you and told you that as a friend, I know you would accept that, but that's quite a vulnerable place to put myself, and I would be worried about that.
Interesting what you say though, because I mean, I was thinking that, like, for many of us, particularly when you become a parent, no one's taught you how to be a parent, so you tend to parent the way that you were parented. You take on those sort of traits, don't you? And sometimes, if you had a bad experience, you go, I'm never going to be like that. But I find myself saying things that my parents said, and even just, I don't know, the way society views masculinity and men. I was watching my son play football the other day, and he fell over and he banged his head. My wife was like, oh no, is he okay? And I was like, get up, Caleb, it's still on your shoulders, you'll be okay, you've got 2 legs, what's wrong with you? Get on with it, run it off. And I was like, oh my goodness, where did that come from? Like, it was just like ingrained response,
Because your dad probably said that to you, how many years ago, and
it was like, you got a broken leg, run it off, mate, it'll be fine. I realized that though that's about physical health, I think when I've struggled with my mental health, it's almost been a very similar thing. Just get through it. And I think for me, it's been so interesting that 100% I have been that person that I had to hit crisis point until I was willing to get help, and I never heard medication talked about 20 years ago. And it was seen as very much the weak thing to do. And I'm not saying that medication is like the answer to everything, because I think actually talking therapies are good, friendship's good, working out what your triggers are all equally as important. But it was a sense that so many guys, we just wait until we can't take any more. I remember there was I remember watching a clip from Only Fools and Horses. Do you remember Only Fools and Horses? And Rodney's character, his wife Cassandra had a miscarriage, and he was going through just like torment, but never said anything. And so Dale, his brother, took him in the lift and secretly stopped the lift. So they had to sit down for hours. And of course, he thought the lift was broken. And it was like, you can't run away in an empty lift, Rodney. And it almost like forced the issue to come out. And I think so often the tragedy is who do we have in our lives that actually we can open up to?
For people listening, I first met you when I was interviewing you about something called Kintsugi Hope. Yeah. And it's about about this bowls and well any sort of china broken, glued back together with golden glue. So you highlight the cracks. So this bowl might have been broken. You've put it back together with all the cracks highlighted. And I kind of feel like we need to remember as men that that's what we are. I mean, we might, no one is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody struggles. Everybody's got a threshold. So I remember doing a homeless breakfast run for a church in central London, All Souls Church, a while back. I did it with my kids. It's sort of one of these things. My kids, I thought, oh, they're getting really complacent. They're just like expecting things. I'm going to do the church breakfast run and show them that actually life is hard for people. And I actually feel like, I know there's me trying to do that, so I'll take my kids and they'll learn. And actually, I learned so much. And what I remember thinking is we do it every 2 weeks, and you'd see people on that run, that sort of breakfast run, going around different parts of London, and they were dressed like the guy who was in the office with me the day before. And then 2 weeks later, they looked really disheveled. And it made me think that, and you'd asked about their stories, and none of us, we're all just a couple of tragic incidents away from 100%. totally falling to pieces. All of us. I don't care. I mean, I've got a profile, I'm a presenter. I've got a house in London, all that. But if my wife left me and I lost my job, I'm broken. I'm done. And if I've got a safety net of friends, they can help me. But if I haven't, I could be like that guy who I saw with the suit, and I think we're all like that. And I think what hurries it up or makes it you more vulnerable to that is if you don't, when things are going wrong, you don't start to recognize those things and talk about those things, whether it's a friend, whether it's therapy, whether it's your boss in work. I'm struggling, it's that conversation. If you just bury your head in the sand, which I think a lot of men do, and we're sort of wired to do that because we're meant to be tough and we're meant to, be able to cope with this stuff. Before long, you find yourself, all those tragedies, all those things have actually culminated in something much bigger. And yeah, we're all very close to that. We're all a lot closer than we think to that sort of event, but we think we're sort of safe. I mean, you've talked about this stuff in your book, Brighter Days, haven't you, about your experiences? Did it change when you started to talk about things? So you said you hit rock bottom. You had to hit rock bottom before you started talking about things. Firstly, did you find friends that you could talk to? And secondly, did it make a difference straight away? Or is it one of these long, like slow burner things?
Yeah, I think for me, it was a relief to talk about things. I remember it was suggested that I went to have therapy, and that sounded like terrifying. I can't think of anything worse of like sitting down for an hour and talking about myself and the why I'm wired the way I am and that. And I remember my therapist saying to me, Patrick, how do you think of self-compassion? And I was like, I'm a bloke. I don't do baths and I don't do candles. And it just sounds selfish, and it sounds like navel gazing, and and I'm an activist at heart. I want to change the world. I want to do stuff. But I realized, and she said to me, you have totally misunderstood what self-compassion is. And then she said, I'll never forget, she said, self-compassion isn't self-indulgence. It's not the extra bit of chocolate cake or the glass of wine to take the edge off. Most of the things we think are self-compassionate are self-indulgence, just make us feel guilty in the long run, actually. She said self-compassion isn't selfish, where it's all about you and you make a drama out of everything. It's not self-pity. It's also not about self-esteem. Self-esteem comes often from external values around what people think of you. And I think the challenge for a lot of the younger generation with social media the way it is, that becomes even more, what do people think of me? Am I enough? And that type of stuff, particularly if you're a guy, how do I show those characteristics? And then she just said this. She said, self-compassion is talking to yourself the way you would talk to your best friend. And I realized that I'm so self-critical, and that I constantly, have negative thoughts, beat myself up that I'm not enough, I'm not academic enough like some of my friends were. And then what I found is, as I started speaking about it, and I think you said this earlier in the conversation about being honest, I found that honesty breeds more honesty. And I found it almost like, I remember I was at the school gates, right? And there was this dad there, and hopefully he's not listening in, but he looked a bit like Phil Mitchell of EastEnders. And he was saying, how you doing? And I was like, actually, it's been a bit of a tough time, and I'm starting a charity called Kintsugi, and I explained what that meant. And he went, oh yeah, I've got anxiety. And I was like, you're kidding me, right? And then we had a conversation which suddenly went to a depth which I would never have dreamt about. And all it took was one moment of honesty, one moment of vulnerability. And then the relationship with that dad just changed forever, because, and so I do think that people do want to have that connection, but sometimes it takes someone to show the courage, I guess, of opening up. But it was hard going to the doctors. Oh mate, that was like asking for medication. That was a big thing for me. It was like I should never go on medication, but I realized that when I managed to get to the doctors and finally have that conversation, that just brought me up to just feel a little bit more of a level kill, which meant I could start doing the therapy and the other bits as well.
Why was it hard? But is that's a sort of masculine feeling of you should be able to cope?
Yeah, it was that 100% that I should be able to cope. And it was almost like, I think because in my job, particularly the first charity that I run, you know, I was dealing with parents whose kids have been killed. I was traveling a lot to some of the poorest countries in the world. And I was like, what right do I have to be depressed? You know, when I compare my life to so many other people's lives, not realizing that actually mental health isn't a respecter of class or people. You know, I know that, you know, poverty can make your mental health worse. Of course it can, because, you know, the anxiety that's attached to it. But like it just came. And I think also coming from a faith background, there were some people who were like, you should just be able to pray it away, you know, and I couldn't. And I was like, so now I'm depressed. Yeah. And now God doesn't like me as well. So that's really cheered me up.
So, you need that.
So I was in a bit of a, yeah, I was in a bit of a state, to be honest, but it is a huge challenge. And I think, and particularly when I looked at the stats, the thing that staggered me was the 40 to 49 age bracket, which I've just left. And
same here. Just out of it. You're out of the woods.
I'm embracing the midlife crisis.
Stats are really helpful, but you know, obviously, because I've just turned 50 as well, and I sort of feel like, oh, I'm out of the woods. It's a breeze now from here on in, and clearly it's not. But see, that's quite interesting, isn't it? That, you know, why that stat between 40 and 49? What was the stat? I can't remember what it was. That's when men struggle the most, is it? That's the highest suicide rate, I think, isn't it?
Suicide, yeah, that's where that's the most at the moment. Yeah, and I think that's a huge challenge.
So I don't know. Someone who's an expert might, you know, write in and say, oh, you know, it's rubbish. But for me, I've always thought every suicide is preventable. I don't know if that's an outrageous thing to say, but if you have cancer or, you know, heart disease or something like that, you know, maybe you can't be treated. I mean, you'd like to think everybody can be treated, but you know, cancer gets caught late on. My mother died of bowel cancer. It was too late, and bowel cancer is quite a treatable one, but there are some forms of cancer which are just really, you know, it's gonna get you eventually. But with suicide, if every person who is having suicidal thoughts had the right level of care, and of course that's not everybody can, there's always going to be people who slip through the net, but if everybody could have the right treatment, the right level of care, I believe that suicide could be avoided. And I'm not saying that is possible, but I think it just means that every time you see figures like that about male suicide, any suicide, but we're focusing on male suicide today, it just everyone is tragic, every death is tragic, but it just makes it that bit more tragic, because if they could have got the right help, they could have been saved, and the family that have lost a dad or a son or a brother wouldn't be going through that if they could have got the right level of care.
Yeah,
I find it quite upsetting.
Yeah,
because people can be saved. I mean, you know, it's just, you need to be given the right level of care, and it's just not happening.
Yeah, I think what I found quite staggering around thinking about suicide, and I guess, you know, I've lost people in my life to suicide who've died by suicide, and the impact across, you know, obviously the immediate family, but then the wider, you know, in this case it was a young person, the school, the community. I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking. But there's a myth that says talking about suicide can like plant the idea in someone's head. And actually, the research suggests the opposite is true, that actually talking about these issues can actually save a life. And I think that's partly why we're doing this tonight, is actually going, you know, these issues need to be talked about. And I think that when you see people like yourself who have been incredibly successful, yet have had family challenges and, you know, your own challenges, and like you say, we're only a couple of steps away, if we're honest, from life turning out very, very different. I think having those conversations, and it may seem cheesy and cliche, but we've got to, you know, we've got to find people who we can reach out to. Sean, do you think the media has a role to play in the way they portray men, particularly? And again, if you're listening, I'd be fascinated to know what you think in the chat, because men often don't come across as vulnerable. I mean, I grew up with the A-Team and Rambo, and you know, and and that type of male role model, and you know, James Bond would obviously, in those days, it was very un-PC, and it was you know, in the way he was portrayed as the ultimate male role model. But in media generally, do you think it's getting better, or do you think that actually we've got a long way to go?
So yeah, of course, I was brought up in the same era as you, and very much so. You know, we were in those formative years. So you've turned 50 this year as well, haven't you? Yeah. So we're the same school year, probably. Oh yeah. So very much we were told, you look great for it, by the way. That's the male bonding.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't need any makeup either. So
I know you're going to reveal.
Did you, Sean? Did you need makeup?
Or was that... I knew you'd throw me under the bus. So I keep having to explain to the viewer and listener what certain things. Can I just explain that I sat down here? I've got this massive light, and I looked at we were just before we did this interview, and I thought, God, I'm like shining like an oil slick. It's terrible. I looked just like you could see your reflection in my forehead. So I thought, so obviously I work in telly, and there's makeup in telly. So I said, I'm just going to put a bit of anti-shine on, and then we agreed not to talk about it, and you're just revealing it on air. So this is how not to have a male friendship.
Yeah,
you tell things, and they just tell everybody. So I reveal all my secrets. Anyway, so I put a bit of anti-shine on. But you know, that I'm showing my vulnerability. I'm quite happy to sit here and say
you're comfortable. You're comfortable in your own skin. That's the key thing.
Yeah,
as long as it's got makeup on.
Yeah. So I was brought up in the same era as you. And so yeah, those messages were in those formative years as young men. It's sort of, you know, going back to what I was saying about the previous generations, it sort of was that, wasn't it? It was being tough. I remember my grandfather, a lovely man, but he said he fought in the war, and he said stiff upper lip was one of his like things he said a lot, you know, because that was what we were told, stiff upper lip. You know, you hurt yourself, stiff upper lip, get on with it. A bit like you talking to your son on the football pitch, you know, you've broken your leg, but just carry on, you know, you've got another leg. Yeah. It's that sort of attitude, and that's what I think we were brought up with men to be like and to aspire to. I don't think, I talked to my wife, I don't think my wife was brought up like that. That's how we were as boys, since brought up. So, and that's what we saw on telly. So nowadays, I think we are in a much better place than that in terms of what we expect from men. But I still think there are real underlying themes, and you hear people say, you hear broadcasters talk about how, you know, you need to man up. You need to, and that's why I'm being a bit careful. I don't want to name people, but there are people, you know, you probably can think of the broadcaster, but there are people who, you know, who I've worked with who talk about, oh, well, they need to man up, and that, you know, a generation won the war and they didn't cry, you know, things like that. Well, you know, I'm sure many of them were really mucked up, and they beat their wives up and their kids and whatever because they were totally screwed up. I mean, you know, it's easy to look back with rose-tinted spectacles, but there are all sorts of problems after the war. And those people didn't talk about those things. And I think now, yeah, I think there's a long way to go. We've come a long way from when we were growing up in the 70s or 80s, but there's some bad stuff said, and it has a massive influence on young men, older men like us. And it's a lot more powerful than you think, particularly when you're young, when you're watching telly, and those are the messages of how men should be. It becomes your fabric and who you are and who you want to be. And it's not like I'm going to be like that person. It just infiltrates into your mind. So yeah, I think the media can play a massive role. It did when we were young, and it still does in a negative way, but definitely not as bad as it was.
No, and I think it's important to note, isn't it, that things are changing, and music, you know, I find that music sometimes is starting to actually get much more social conscious, It's getting a lot more talking about mental health and people being able to relate to the lyrics a lot more. It's still, again, got a long way to go. But I remember even watching Iron Man the other day. Iron Man has a panic attack. I was like, and even I was like, how can Iron Man have a panic attack? You know, it was like, that is crazy. But I was like, actually, you know, my son who was watching it was like, oh, even superheroes go through tough times, you know, and I was like, yeah, maybe they do. And so I think it's really, really important to keep having this conversation. And Sean, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for modeling what we're talking about, actually, and just being so real and honest and authentic. And thank you for what you do as well in all these issues. Thank you for your friendship. Really appreciate it. Sorry for mentioning the makeup. Please forgive me about that. But yeah, it's been
I'm not talking
great.
to you ever again.
Never
That's the
talk,
last
that's
thing I
it.
tell you.
No more. No more.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's always good to talk to you, and I suppose it's really nice to be able to have the conversations that we've had over a cup of coffee, but where maybe as you said at the beginning, maybe there's someone listening and it will make a difference. And if it's just one person it makes a difference with, then hey, we've done a job that's why I talk to people like you and you talk to people like me, to make that difference.
Wow, some really interesting stuff there. And I just want to thank everyone that's been putting comments in the chat. The chat's been really, really busy. If you're listening with this in the background, can I encourage you to get on your computer to read some of the comments? Some absolutely fascinating insights there, things that I have never thought about, actually, and people sharing some of their own stories as well, and tips for how we connect, I guess, together. I mean, I want to bring Claude back if you're around there, Claude. I was really interested in what Sean was talking about particularly around the whole area of upbringing. And you know, he was talking about how his father brought him up and how his grandfather brought him up, and then in some ways we've become a little bit of a product of that. But going back to what you were talking about at the start, particularly when we've been through traumatic stuff and we've never dealt with that has an effect later in lives. And I've heard a lot of people say that trauma is often stored in our bodies rather than our heads. Can you just unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think that was an amazing conversation. That was really like life-giving, nuance and layered, and there were, you know, so many key points that was touched on there. But yeah, in the sense of how trauma, there's a term called the body keeps the score. So the body remembers what has happened and stores that experience. And it's really important that we are able to talk about what has happened to us, because if we are unable to, we then often will communicate in different ways. We will communicate what has happened to us without actually even saying it. So the ramifications of the impact on our lives can be to immense detriment. So when I think of, if I don't mind sharing, and I've seen some of the points in the conversation, and I'm usually mindful of what I disclose about myself, but this feels really important and could be a potential teachable moment. I remember being 15 and growing up, my rite of passage was, you know, accolades from the guys in the community. And if you had a reputation and you were kind of feared or seen as to be someone who didn't, you know, take crap, and you got into fights and you had some money and your name kind of rang bells, then you were seen as a man. And I guess the point that Sean made around like where we get our, I guess, our picture of what a man is. For me, mine was an amalgamated version of different people that I saw in my local community, whether it was someone who was respected because they were a good fighter, this person was great with the girls, this person knew how to talk. So unconsciously, I started to create a persona that I thought, you know, would serve me well and would protect me. But these were all elements of men or boys trying to find their self. And why I use this example, because at 15 I went to prison for the first time. It was in 1995. My friends were preparing for their GCSEs, and I'd been excluded from school. And I remember sitting on the prison van as a 15-year-old, petrified, my heart racing, so much uncertainty, didn't know what was around the corner. And I got into an argument with some boys on the bus who were from a neighboring community that we had issues. 20 years later, I was doing some training. I was on the course as a delegate, and we were doing some trauma informed training. And the facilitator asked me, or asked the group, there was maybe about 30 of us. We all worked with young people, and they asked us, if you feel comfortable, just close your eyes and maybe think of something that made you nervous. So I closed my eyes, and I didn't know in that moment that I would go back 20 years later, 20 years back to that little boy, that little school kid that got kicked out of school, that was sitting on the prison van. And at 35, my heart was racing. I could smell what the sweatbox, so that's the prison van, what the sweatbox smelled like. I could hear Capital FM. I could hear Kiss FM playing in the background. And my heart was racing. My throat went dry. My body became tense. And why I share that example, that little boy suppressed all of his feelings and his emotions and his thoughts in order to survive. And I didn't know that was a traumatic experience, but my body stored that. My body kept that. And it was only going to therapy for 2 years. I had about 60 plus sessions. Post that training session, I was able to identify that was a traumatic experience. And I was able to release that experience from my body, and also be able to name it, and then also be able to connect various dots in my life, why I behaved, why I acted the way I did, the suppression of certain emotions and feelings. And I did that in order to survive. And later on, I went on to write a project, a musical project that documented that time in my life, to give myself a voice, to be able to tell little Claude, you're safe. You don't need to be scared anymore. No one's going to hurt you. And that was my expression of freedom and speaking out. So I say that to say it's imperative that we do find spaces, which sometimes can be difficult, to communicate those early experiences. And I think the last thing I'd say is there's a lot of unlearning and reprogramming that we have to do. And if I think you shared about when your little boy was on the ground playing football. And I remember being told very early, when I grazed my knee on the concrete football pitch that had stones and glass on the football pitch, gravel, I grazed my knee, blood's gushing out. I was told, stop crying. So in that moment as a child, I was literally taught that I need to stop crying, because it's not what you do, that your feelings and your emotions and the pain that you're feeling is not valid. And that was just playing football. So if I think about all the children that have been told that from the very onset, what does that look like in teenage years, adolescence, 20s, 30s and 40s? So yeah.
I guess what's scary about that was like how that just came into my head without even thinking about it. Do you know what I mean? I was like, where did that come from? And just thinking about what you're saying about trauma, just really briefly, because we know the body does keep score, and if we're talking about sometimes some of our emotion, if we don't share our emotions, or we don't have the space to, for whatever, for many reasons that we've talked about, does trauma ever come out in rage? Because one of the key things that we know about this country is the huge stats on domestic violence are absolutely off the chart.
Yeah. So it will come out in rage. It will come out in addiction. it will come out in self-harm. And when I say self-harm, not just in terms of like maybe cutting or physically hurting yourself, but harmful practices, harmful behaviors that can impact you, you know, mentally, emotionally.
Yeah.
It has a way, because it needs to be released.
Yeah.
So then it can come out in rage, it can come out in sadness, and unfortunately and sadly it could come out in suicide.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Claude. Well, let's get Jasmine. She's been collating the questions.
Yeah.
And we'd love to take some questions from the chat, and we've also we will go on a bit later than planned, just because we've got this amazing Dan Walker video, and I'm sure that all of you remember where you were when you heard the news about Gary Speed taking his dying by suicide, and so we just wanted to show you a bit of that as well. And yeah, so Jasmine, what have people been saying in the chat? Have you got a few questions for Claude and myself there?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I go to the questions, I just want to thank everybody that's joined us this evening for opening up. It's incredibly brave and empowering for you to be sharing your stories. And I'm so grateful that, and Patrick and Claude as well, are so grateful that you've joined us this evening and you feel, you know, that this is a safe space to share your stories. That is why we did this, and that is what we want to create. So the first question is, if we're uncomfortable talking to friends or family and we don't have a Claude, how do we get to talk about our issues?
Wow. If we don't have a Claude, what do we do, Claude?
Yeah, it's a great question. I should start off with the caveat that each question that is posed is going to be unique to the individual that posed that question, and whatever answers that you get from myself and Patrick, I think we have a saying in the Caribbean: you eat the meat and you spit out the bones. So just be mindful, like, we're not saying this is exactly what you must do. So really hold what we're saying. I guess, yeah, using discretion and discernment, if I can use those as terms. So if you don't have friends, or you have friends, you have family, you don't have someone like myself that you can speak to, that could be a really lonely place. If I'm totally honest, that's where I want to start off by saying that can be a really lonely place, and could mean that you have been holding this for a long period of time. I think what is really important is that sometimes it does take a risk of you actually reaching out to someone in your circle. And it may look like, you know, there are various forums online, you know, so if you feel like you don't want to speak to someone, you might not have the finances to pay for therapy. There's that shame and embarrassment in terms of the people in your family and friendship group that you can't speak to. I think there are going to be various therapeutic forums online. What I will say, though, is it is really important that every man at some point is able to ETB, and I call it empty the bag. It's really important that we are able to empty what we're carrying, because I think when we go to the airport, we check in our luggage, and when we empty the bag, we're able to kind of travel a little bit lighter. But I am mindful that not everybody has a friendship group, and that can make it really harder to be able to speak and talk. But I do think it is important that at least you try to find one person, and it might be quite risky and fearful for the first time sharing something. But I think, as Patrick said earlier on, honesty does beget honesty.
Yeah. I think the other thing I would say, Jasmine, is there are some amazing charities out there. Men's Shed, I'll give them a bit of a shout out. I know that they've been growing across the UK, and Leo, who used to work for me at XLP as well, he works for them, and they do some amazing stuff. But I think also, I feel challenged by what Clive wrote in the chat. You know, sometimes it's about also just trying to be the change we wish to see, I guess. And maybe it is about trying to initiate, which I know is hard. I, do a lot of public speaking, but I'm incredibly shy. And so, when people talk about, just connect with this person, connect with that person, go to that cafe, do this, do that, I actually find that really, really hard. And sometimes doing something like this actually is quite, I find, an easier way to hide behind my screen a little bit, if I'm really being honest with you. But I think whatever works, whatever works for your personality type. And I know sometimes we have to try and step out of our comfort zone, and sometimes that's a good thing to do. But I think just connecting somewhere and being really intentional about it, and sometimes it's just a tiny little change, and can have a massive impact. So I encourage you guys to connect. Maybe we should connect online a bit more, who knows. And it seems to be a really good thing to do. Any other questions, Jasmine, for us?
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, guys. So just on both what you were saying, Claude, about kind of emptying the bag and finding therapeutic ways, somebody has asked about journaling. So I thought, kind of spinning that question around, what other things could people do aside from just finding somebody safe to talk to? What other activities and things could people do that would help them empty the bag?
Great. I'm a massive fan of journaling. And so there is something called a self-care wheel. I think is really an important way that an individual can look at key areas of their life. And the 6 areas of the self-care will look at how we look after our physical, so our physical frame, our body, what we're eating, what time are we going to sleep, how we take care of ourselves, what we're doing, what we say yes to, what we say no to. So our physical, how we look after our mind, so our psychological, what are we reading, what are we taking in. Then there's the emotional area, you know then there's the spiritual area, like what are we doing spiritually? Some people may meditate, some people may do yoga, some people may go to a synagogue, some people may pray, some people may, be in nature. Some people may do like retreats, but like how we take care of our spiritual well-being. And then having personal goals, like doing things that give us life. I think someone spoke about in the group going to the gym or ninjutsu, or being around other men, but doing things that actually you enjoy. Some people might do chess, some people might hang out with their friends, some people might go out and have a party and shake a leg. Like connecting to things that give you life and having like personal goals, and being really intentional. And then your professional development, like what are you doing work wise, like, or employability wise? Do you run your own business or do you work for a company? But ensuring that a place where you may spend a lot of your time, which can be a stress induced environment, or it might not be a stress induced environment, but what are your goals in your working professional life? And that might even look like, going back to study, but those 6 areas I think are really important, paying close attention to and setting like some goals, some targets, not to beat yourself over the head with, but to kind of create a lifestyle that brings you life, I guess, and it's sustainable. And I think in those 6 areas, you may find that you connect with other people who may be on similar journeys, and then now your sphere of influence, your community, your tribe is slowly growing as a result.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I think I don't think there's much to add to that. I think we're holistic beings, and I think the thing what Claude is saying that is, our physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and behavioural, social health, if you like, they all connect with each other. They have a knock-on effect. I know when I'm actually, one of my triggers, I guess, is when I'm physically not doing very well, or, my knees. Some people know I've had major limb reconstruction surgery. If my knees are hurting, if physically I'm unwell, then that triggers my mental health. And I think sometimes just being aware of your triggers, that sort of self-awareness, is absolutely huge for people. And again, that's why, I always talk about self-awareness, because I think one size never fits all. And it's so different for different people. We've all had different upbringings, different cultures, different things that we've had to face in our lives. And so I think just being aware of your triggers and allowing other people to know what your triggers are as well. You know, I often say to people, if I'm doing a lot of talking, like, just check on me later, because again, you know, it's quite vulnerable giving out, and then I can hit a bit of a downer. So I think having those accountability relationships in your life and knowing your triggers is really key.
Yeah, and I think there's something that you said. I remember I had like lower back issues for many years, and I was a part of this study, and we realized that when I was stressed, like how it would trigger the back pains,
Yeah.
like severely. And so as you're saying, right, like it's all intersected, our mind, our body, our spirit. Yeah, and they all overlap. And I think like what I would say about the accountability element is, you know, sometimes it can be really tough, especially when people put you on a pedestal, whatever that pedestal is. You know, it's not uncommon for men to be seen as protectors and providers, but also, like, depending on your job title, your income, or what you've got going on, that sometimes that can shape your identity and can shape how people see you. And I think it's really important to kind of lay that aside. So amongst my friendship group, I'm not Claude the therapist. I'm not Claude the clinical supervisor. I'm just Claude the friend. And like, not hiding behind what we do. I think that's something that as men, it's really important. Like, not being defined by our profession or our careers.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to go to this video now. Hang in with us, guys. It's only 5 minutes, this video, and it's such a powerful film if you haven't seen it before. Dan Walker, who is a friend of mine, we've worked together in media. I text him about this evening, and he WhatsApped me this video. So you can't see it on YouTube. There's a really dodgy version of it where someone's filmed it off the telly, but it's not the full version. And so this has come directly from Dan himself.
Gary Speed was an amazing footballer and just an all-round good bloke. Anybody who played alongside Gary would always say that he was brilliant in the dressing room, always the player that others went to when they had a problem. I always found him to be a really kind bloke. He was always interested in other people. He'd always ask you questions about your family, about, you know, what you'd been up to, and he'd remember things you'd said to him in previous conversations. And I don't think there are many people like that.
What school?
The school where you're left and right.
Harden High School.
There you go.
Did you? Yeah. So that was another one. Where are you from then? Whereabouts? Village. Oh, yeah.
Do we only employ North Walians around here? First of all, I can't believe it's 10 years ago. I'll be honest with you, I remember the day really vividly, and I do go over it in my mind quite a bit. And I remember when we walked into the studio, one of the camera operators came over and spoke to Gary about the fact they'd gone to the same school.
You still live there now?
No, I moved up here now.
Have you?
Gary did his normal thing. He just talked for, 5 or 10 minutes.
The Glynn's open. They're opening the Glynn, you know.
I saw the look on the camera operator's face. He was absolutely delighted that Gary was interested in him, and Gary was asking him questions about, his family. And that was what Gary was all about. So, we've got Mr. Speed on camera. Let's start with Gary Speed then, okay? The actual show was brilliant.
It's good, that. Nice one. That's good.
After the show finished, I took him upstairs because Alan Shearer, one of his great friends, was working on Match of the Day. So we went upstairs into the Match of the Day production office. And then I stayed a little bit longer. And the last thing I said to him was, I'll give you a call Monday and we'll organise a game of golf. And that's where we left it. Shook him by the hand and said, you're really good today, and left. The next morning, the Sunday morning, I remember being sat in church and my phone was just going crazy, like phone call after phone call after phone call, and text. And I remember exactly where I was sat. I looked across the row and I said to my wife, something's happening, I need to go and get this. And I walked outside, it was freezing cold morning. As I looked at my phone, there was a call from Alan. And he didn't even say like hello, he just said, have you heard about Gary? Sorry. Let's give it a sec. I remember I just walked home like really numb. I just couldn't fathom what had happened when you think about the day that I'd had with him the day before. Then you just go back over absolutely everything. You can't help ask yourself whether you could have done something, or whether there's something you should have seen, or whether there were some signs there that you could have, helped. But I really don't think there were. The whole of the country was in shock. I mean, people were heartbroken. I think everybody who knows him really well would say that they don't have the answers to why he did what he did. But all I know is that his two boys and those that knew him best felt that something happened that day, that Gary felt for whatever reason there was no other way out. And that's incredibly sad and distressing, particularly for his family, because his two boys absolutely adored him and he loved them. But they miss him, and nobody would have wished for them to go through what they've been through, but I think both of them would say that they know now very clearly that if they were ever struggling, if they felt they couldn't cope, then they'd talk to someone. And I think if Gary had spoken to somebody that night, I think he'd still be here. I think that's the hard thing. I do think that if two blokes had gone to a game a decade ago, they'd just talk about the football. I'd like to think now that a decade on, things are different, and they might have a conversation about how they're feeling. What happened to Gary has, and still makes a lot of people think about their friends and those around them, and I'd like to think that's a good thing.
Wow. I don't know if you remember where you were when you heard the news of Gary's speed. I think it was so shocking for so many people. I think that last bit that Dan Walker said there, if only he would have spoken to someone, then he'd still be with us today. And just looking at how successful he was as well. And I think it's sobering. It's sobering, but a good reminder as well that no matter what walk of life you're in, that some of these challenges affect all of us, and we just need to have the honest conversation. And so before we finish, I just wanted to get to a couple of more questions just for another 5 minutes or so. Jasmine, I don't know if you're still around. I hope you are. I'm sure you are. But were there some other questions in the chat that we could discuss just as we finish off?
So here's a question from Sam. Do you have any advice on how to protect yourself from suffering from mental health issues in the first place following an incident? So rather than letting it affect you and then dealing with it with things like talking therapy, how do you protect yourself from the offset?
Wow, what a great question that was. Claude, are you there? Did you hear that? Maybe he's done a runner. So how do you protect yourself in the first place? That preventative side, I guess, and from an incident that had happened in the past. Yeah, I guess from personal experience, and I don't know, some of you know I've written this book called Brighter Days, and Brighter Days kicks off with telling about us when I was involved in a very, very serious car accident at the age of, I was 11, and I was the only person in the car that wasn't in hospital. My mum, my dad, my sister, and my nan were all rushed into hospital, and as a little boy, I didn't think that I'd see them again. And I remember coming round from the accident. There was lots of ambulances everywhere, and I remember saying to myself, "Be strong, hold it together." And I think I've taken that "be strong, hold it together" right throughout my whole life. And I've run two reasonably successful charities. I've just started a business as well, and always been the CEO or the founder. Be strong, hold it together. And I came to a point in my life where I couldn't be strong and hold it together anymore, and I crashed. And then I've always felt like, what would stop me crashing again? And I had to make changes, but I think one of the biggest changes I had to make, when people ask me what was one of the biggest lessons that I learned in that whole process, is that my jobs has always been trying to help other people with some huge issues, suicide, knife crime, domestic violence, poverty, been to some of the poorest countries on earth, and experienced and held kids in my arms that have died a couple of days later. And I just realized that the biggest thing I could do is realize that I just can't fix it. I can't fix it. I'm not the rescuer. And it's not as if I thought I was something special, because I'd always sort of struggled, like beating myself up a bit, but it was almost like, I'm not the rescuer, and I'm also not the sponge for other people's pain. And so, just going back to that point where one size doesn't fit all, is I just had to learn a whole load of strategies that would work with me and my personality. And but one of the biggest ones was to change the way I thought. I just felt like if I didn't fix it, no one else would, because I was often dealing with very marginalized young people, very marginalized and broken people. And I realized that actually I just couldn't do that anymore, and I couldn't be a sponge as well. And so over the years, I've learned resilient strategies. I've learned a bit of a toolkit. Journaling was massive for me. I think Barry asked for journaling in the chat. Massive. In fact, I don't think I would have written any books about my journals. I found that incredibly helpful, and having people who believe in you as well, hugely beneficial. And yeah, so it's a brilliant question, and I think that self-awareness of who you are again is so important.
Amazing.
Anything else
Thank you,
there, Jason?
Patrick. So
No
Ricky's
problem.
asked, how can I support my brother who I know is struggling but doesn't want to open up? I don't want to force him. And I think that's quite important, because we often see people around us that we know are dealing with difficult things, and we know that potentially talking or exploring that might help. But how do we do that in a way where they don't feel forced or feel like they're doing something they don't really want to do?
Yeah, that is huge, isn't it? And I think how we support others is massive. I think for me, it's about finding common ground. And I often say this with my kids. I know that my kids, for instance, respond really differently to opening up, if you like. And like my teenage daughter, the only way I can get her to open up is I deliberately take her on car trips, because I'm taxi, right? I'm dad. And so now I even make some of my sort of dropping off a little bit longer, because that's the place she feels safe and she does not stop talking. And I've noticed it with the lads as well. I mean, it's stereotype, but we go and watch Spurs, and that's very bad for our mental health. But it's actually the journey there is actually what is that safe place where you start talking about life. And so I think it is finding common ground and finding those places where you can just naturally, and sometimes it's just about asking the right questions. And it's interesting, there's an organization called, I think they're called Are You Okay? And they use this technique called ALEC, which stands for A is just about asking the right questions. And sometimes it's just stuff like, I don't know, just really practically, you haven't seen yourself lately. Are you feeling okay? And I've noticed, you've been a little bit, you've stopped texts, and you've stopped replying, and then L stands for listen. Giving people your full attention, let them know you're hearing what they're saying and you're not judging. And I think the key thing is we're not called to be doctors. We don't have to diagnose problems or even offer solutions. Sometimes it's just about listening. And then going, actually, that can't be easy. How long have you felt this way? E stood for encourage action. What's the tiny little things that you can improve? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you exercising? How are you eating at the moment? And just suggesting maybe, check out going to the doctors, and if you need a lift, or, I can help you out with that. But again, not pressurizing, but just encouraging. And then I think the C stands for check in. And I think also consistency is just checking in. A text is massive. FaceTime, just checking in how people are doing and creating that common ground, I think, is really important.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And then one of the questions that I did want to revisit, it was a little bit earlier on in the chat, but I think the things that we've covered and the fact that this is an online event is quite powerful. So the question is, are people braver behind a screen?
I think people are, just in my experience. So whether that is events like this, or a lot of the one-to-one therapy that I do is online. And sometimes, people do say that they do find it easier to do something like this, or to share something. As much as they are connected, there's that element of detachment. And I think as long as people feel safe to share, I think that's the most important thing. And if they are sharing, then that's great. So if it means that it takes place online or on a screen in an environment like this, then that's a massive step. And that's the needle moving forward in a positive direction.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as we come into land, I just wanted to say to people, one is thank you for being with us and sticking with us the whole time. I want to thank Claude so much, Claude, for your time and your expertise and showing your authenticity and vulnerability. Particularly want to thank Jasmine and Sarah behind the scenes, who really helped put this evening on as well. And just to say, guys, please write in the chat how you found this evening. Do thank our guests, because I think so often what happens is people go away from events like this, and because there's no one to chat to at the end, you can feel a bit flat. So please thank Claude in the chat and thank the people that have organised this evening as well. And just to say, if there's anything we can do to help, please get in touch. As you know, Claude's already talked about some of his stuff that he's involved in. Do check out his website. I'd really encourage you to do that. I've also written this book called Brighter Days, 12 Steps to Strengthen Your Wellbeing. We are being literally blown away about how well this is done. It's been written in a completely different style to my other books, just really practical, short tips, short stories, really down to earth, very, very honest. And you can get this from any bookshop really, but if you wanted to support a charity at the same time, you can get it from Kintsugi Hope, and we'll put that in the chat and get it from their store. And there's also these t-shirts, Brighter Days, and on the back it says never give up on hope. And someone actually sent me a picture of themselves wearing this t-shirt and saying never giving up on hope was one of the most important things. And obviously there are places like the Samaritans, there's Men's Shed, there's some other amazing charities that are doing some incredible work in this area as well. Do get in touch with us. If you wanted us to visit your workplace, then Brighter Days, that's what we do. And we visit, we're working with the NHS, we're working with businesses, we're working with schools, doing CPD training. And also, we run our own CPD course online, which is starting in January. So if you want to do 4 weeks online with us, if you're not sick of my face by now, you could do it. It's brilliant. It's such fun. There's only about 12 places because we like to keep it smallish, because we just love the interaction. And I've done it, Jasmine's done it, Sarah's done it. It's just been really brilliant. People from all over the country join on. So if you want to come online and join on an online course just for 4 weeks in January, I think there's one in March as well, you'd be so welcome to do that, and just get in touch with us. And they'll all be on our socials on Facebook and Twitter, not Twitter, X, and also on Instagram. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much for being here, and we really do appreciate your time. And yeah, and any ideas of how we should follow this up, do let us know. Me and Jasmine and Sarah will chat about it and just see what we think the right thing to do is, but we would love it. Someone's reading Brighter Days with their wife. That is like the best idea I've ever heard on the planet. But that is fantastic. Thank you,
Patrick,
so
can
much.
I just say something quickly? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah,
guys, I just want to say thank you for your time as well. And I just want to say that as men, we are allowed to feel. We are allowed to feel. And there was an amazing reggae artist by the name of Dennis Brown, and he said, he sung "No Man is an Island." So just to let you know that, there are people who are out there prepared and willing to listen and to hear what you have to say. And the last thing I would say, that thing of suck it up and keep it in, it's okay to breathe. It's okay to let it out. We're allowed to breathe. And Lewis Hamilton, for all his greatness, he even has a pit stop. So life can be extremely fast paced, and we're moving and we're achieving, but even he has a pit stop. And I think every man in this chat, myself included, and Patrick, and the women in this space, we all need a pit stop. And whether that's therapy or whether that's not therapy, but a space where you're just able to stop and breathe and be who you are. So just want to say thank you for your time as well. And hopefully you got something from the evening.
Thanks, Claude. That's fantastic. Yeah. Guys, look after yourselves. Have an amazing rest of the week. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Take care. God bless.